For 20 years. My parents called me the slow one. Not behind my back, but at dinner tables, in front of relatives, like it was something to laugh about. My sister. She got everything. Private schools in Boston. Opportunities worth more than I made in a year. A future they said was worth millions. And me. I learned how to disappear. Until one night. In a ballroom in New York City. In front of 300 people. My father gave her the entire company. Every dollar. Every decision. Every ounce of power. And just as I realized I had lost everything, a stranger walked up to me, placed an envelope in my hands, and said, "Your grandmother knew this would happen." We grew up on the Upper East Side of New York City. The kind of place where last names mattered more than first impressions. Where people didn't ask who you were. They asked what you were worth. My family's name wasn't just respected. It was printed on buildings. Quietly engraved into hospital wings. Stitched into scholarship funds. Whispered in boardrooms. My father owned a commercial real estate firm that stretched from New York City to Boston to Chicago. Multimillion-dollar deals. Private equity partners. A company people assumed would stay in the family forever. And in that family, there were only two daughters, Jessica and me. Jessica was everything they wanted. Confident, sharp, effortless. The kind of person who walked into a room, and people adjusted themselves around her. She went to private schools in Boston. Summer programs that cost more than most people's yearly rent. Internships that came with six-figure connections. By 22, she wasn't just successful. She was already expected to take over. Not someday, but soon. And me. I was the explanation. The apology. The uncomfortable silence after someone asked, "Do you have children?" I had dyslexia. Words didn't sit still for me. They shifted, twisted, turned simple sentences into puzzles that took too long to solve. And in my family, taking too long meant you were falling behind. My parents didn't yell. They didn't scream. That would have been easier to understand. Instead, they labeled me, casually, repeatedly, permanently. "She's the slow one." They said it at dinner, at parties, even in front of strangers, like it was just a fact, something everyone should accept. Sunday dinners were performances. Long table, polished silver, conversations that sounded like business meetings. My father would talk about deals, acquisitions, expansion into Chicago, new investors flying in from across the country. Then he'd turn to Jessica. "Tell them about your internship." Applause, smiles, pride. And then, his eyes would land on me, just long enough to remind everyone I was there. And, "She's doing her best." A few polite nods. Small, awkward smiles. And then the conversation would move on. Like I never spoke. But what they didn't understand was that struggling forced me to see things differently. I stopped trying to read like everyone else. I started mapping things. Patterns. Systems. Relationships between people. And money. And decisions. While Jessica memorized answers, I learned how things actually worked. And there was only one person who ever noticed. My grandmother. She lived alone on the Upper West Side, in an apartment filled with old documents, handwritten notes, and stories no one else cared to hear. Every Sunday. Why? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos, only at the end of this hook script. I took the train across New York City, just to sit with her. One afternoon, she looked at me and said, "You're not slow. You just see what other people miss." I didn't understand it then. But she did. She always did. Years later, I would realize something else. She wasn't just watching me learn. She was preparing me. Quietly. patiently, for something I didn't even know was coming. For a moment. That would happen in a ballroom, with 300 people watching, when a stranger would walk up to me, hand me an envelope, and change everything. But before that night happened, before the money, before the power, before everything flipped, there was one moment that made me realize my family had already decided who I was, and they were never going to change their minds. Christmas in our family wasn't about joy, it was about performance. And in our house on the Upper East Side of New York City, performance was everything. Crystal chandeliers, imported wine, a table long enough to remind you who sat at the head of it. My father always sat there, like the room was built around him. That night, Jessica arrived late. Of course she did. But when she walked in, everything stopped. She had just returned from a program in Boston. The kind of academic pipeline that guaranteed Ivy League doors would stay open. My father stood immediately. She just secured her recommendation for Harvard Law. Applause. Glasses raised. Smiles that felt rehearsed for years. And me. I was sitting at the far end of the table, where conversations didn't reach, where eye contact didn't stay long enough to matter. Then my father turned toward me and smiled. Not proudly. Not warmly, but like he was introducing a topic no one wanted to discuss. And she's still finding her path. A few laughs followed. Not loud. Not cruel. Just comfortable. The kind of laughter people use when they agree silently. Jessica didn't defend me. She didn't need to. She was already above it. I looked down at my plate. Not because I was ashamed, but because I had learned something important in that moment. I wasn't being compared anymore. I was being dismissed. And when you're dismissed long enough, you stop asking for permission. You start observing instead. Studying. Listening. Learning where the power actually sits in a room like this. After college, I didn't go to Harvard like Jessica. I didn't get recruited into elite firms in Chicago. I was hired into my father's company. Entry level. Administrative assistant. Salary, $42,000 a year. Jessica's starting compensation package, nearly $280,000. Plus bonuses. Plus future equity discussions already being drafted. They didn't call it favoritism. They called it merit. My job was simple. Print documents. Book rooms. Answer emails no one read. Sit in meetings I was never invited to understand. I wasn't part of decisions. I was part of the background. But something strange happened in those rooms. While they spoke in numbers, I started seeing structure. Deals weren't random. They were patterns. Power wasn't spoken. It was implied. And money always moved the same way. And sometimes, late at night, when the office was empty, I would think about my grandmother, about the way she looked at me, like she already knew how this story would end, like she had already written something I hadn't seen yet, something waiting for the right moment, something that would arrive in an envelope. Then things started changing, subtle at first. My access reduced, my responsibilities reassigned. Meetings I used to sit in suddenly moved without notice. My father never explained it. He didn't need to. In families like mine, decisions are made quietly, and consequences are shared loudly. Until one evening, I overheard something in the hallway. My father's voice. Calm. Controlled. Final. We need to phase her out. A pause. Then. She's becoming a liability. And in that moment, I realized something. I wasn't part of the family business anymore. I was a problem they were preparing to remove. And I had no idea. They had already started planning how. It started like any other morning in New York City. Coffee. Emails. Silence pretending to be productivity. But something felt different. I was called into HR. No explanation. No warning. Just a polite smile that didn't reach the eyes. The room was too clean. Too quiet. Too rehearsed. Due to restructuring, your position is being eliminated. Those words don't sound painful. Until they're directed at you. No anger. No emotion. Just paperwork. Severance details. Exit instructions. Like I was never a person. Just a line item being removed. I nodded. Because that's what you do when you're trained to be invisible. You don't fight the decision. You absorb it. I went back to my desk. Packed slowly. Carefully. Like the time I had left still mattered. But no one looked up. That was when it hit me. In corporations like my father's, you are never fired emotionally. You are just erased. I stopped in the hallway before leaving. Voices behind a closed door. My father. And Jessica. I shouldn't have listened. But I did. She was always temporary. My father's voice. Calm. Certain. We only kept her long enough to avoid questions. A pause. Then Jessica. People are already asking why she's still here. No hesitation. No guilt. Just efficiency. Then my father again. She'll leave quietly. She always does. I stood there, holding a box of my own things, realizing something worse than rejection. I was never part of the plan. I was part of the cover. That night, I didn't cry. Not because I was strong, but because something inside me had changed. Pain stopped being emotional. It became information. I went home. My apartment in Queens felt smaller that night. Like the walls were listening. And in my closet was the wooden box my grandmother left me. I had never opened it. Not fully. Not yet. I kept thinking about her words. When the time comes, you'll know. But what if the time wasn't someday? What if it was already happening? Jessica was buying property discussions in Boston. My father was preparing board restructuring meetings in Chicago. And me. I was calculating how long I could survive without income. Then my phone rang. Jessica. Her voice wasn't emotional. It was controlled. Corporate. Dangerous. I don't know what you think you're doing. But Dad is serious now. Stop pushing this. I didn't understand what she meant. Not yet. That night, I finally opened the wooden box. Inside, a letter. Handwritten. Aged. Intentional. And the first line read, "If you are reading this, then they have already tried to erase you." And that was when I realized. This was never about a job. It was never about favoritism. It was about control. Money. Power. And a decision my grandmother made years ago. That was about to destroy everything my father built. My apartment in Queens was silent that night. Not peaceful. Just waiting. Outside, New York City never really sleeps. But inside my room, everything felt paused. The wooden box finally opened fully. Inside, a sealed letter. A USB drive. A set of legal documents. The letter was the first thing I touched. My hands were shaking. Not from fear. From recognition. If you are reading this, then they have already tried to erase you. I stopped. Because she didn't say if they try. She said already tried. The words didn't feel like comfort. They felt like instructions. Like my entire life had been eat up. 2 days later, I received a call. Unknown number. A man's voice. Calm. Controlled. Professional. Miss Whitford. My name is Jonathan Hale. He paused. I worked with your grandmother. He wasn't just a lawyer. He was something else. A keeper of structure. Of things people thought were already settled. Your grandmother anticipated this. He said, everything you are experiencing was accounted for. I didn't understand. Not yet. Then he said the sentence that changed everything. Your father does not fully control Whitford Holdings. A pause. He never did. He explained it slowly. Whitford Properties wasn't just a company. It was a structure built in layers. Operating company in New York City. Investment arms in Boston. Asset holdings managed through trusts in Chicago. And buried inside it was something I had never heard of before. Voting shares. Not money. Not salary. Not inheritance. Control. Your grandmother retained majority voting control. I froze. And she never transferred it. Everything I thought I knew about my family was wrong. Jessica wasn't the heir. My father wasn't the owner. He was managing something he never fully controlled. Jonathan told me to open the USB. I plugged it in. A folder appeared. Board records. Private. Inside. Internal board votes. Ownership structures. A recording. And then a file labeled 2018_restructure_attempt. My father's voice filled my room. Calm. Confident. Strategic. We reduce her voting percentage to 10%. A pause. Then laughter. From others in the room. My grandmother wasn't weak. She was resisting. And I had never known. The next morning, Jessica called again. But this time, her voice had changed. No warmth. No patience. Only warning. You need to stop this. She said. You don't understand what you're touching. Dad is preparing legal action. A pause. If you continue, you'll lose everything. For the first time, I didn't feel small. I felt positioned. Like I wasn't being attacked randomly. I was being responded to. Jonathan's voice returned. There is a clause in your grandmother's structure. He paused. That activates under one condition. I leaned forward. If your father attempts to remove or silence you. A pause. Control transfers immediately. I stared at the letter again. And suddenly, it wasn't just paper. It was leverage. It was timing. It was a weapon that had been waiting years to be used. And somewhere in New York City, my father had just found out that I had opened the box. And everything he thought he controlled was about to start slipping. Morning in New York City didn't feel normal anymore. Not after what I had seen. Not after what I had heard. Not after what I now knew. The city was still moving. But I wasn't inside it the same way anymore. My phone rang at 8:12 a.m. Jonathan Hale. Same calm voice. But sharper now. They've called an emergency board session. A pause. Your father is trying to contain this. I asked him one question. What does he think he can still control? Jonathan exhaled. Everything he still believes belongs to him. Jessica called immediately after. But this time, she wasn't warning me. She was pleading. You don't understand what you're doing to him. A pause. To all of us. For a moment, I almost believed her. Almost. But then I remembered the dinner tables. The laughter. The silence I was trained to accept. In New York City, Whitford Tower was already awake. Lawyers. Executives. Assistants moving faster than usual. Something was wrong. They just didn't know how badly yet. Inside the executive floor, my father was speaking to legal counsel. Calm voice. But fractured underneath. She doesn't have authority. A pause. She doesn't understand what she's holding. But for the first time, he wasn't confident. The lawyer on his team replied carefully. Sir, the documentation is consistent. Another pause. If the voting structure is verified. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. My father stood still. For the first time. He didn't interrupt. He didn't dominate the room. He just listened. I sat in my apartment in Queens. The box was open now. The documents were real now. The choice was no longer emotional. It was procedural. I called Jonathan. I'm ready. Jonathan's response was immediate. Then we proceed. A pause. The board must be formally notified. By noon. Emails were sent. Official notices. Legal confirmations. Emergency governance activation. In Whitford Properties. Everything stopped pretending to be normal. Calls changed tone. Meetings got cancelled. Executives started asking questions they were afraid to ask yesterday. My father received the notice at 12:47 p.m. He didn't speak. Didn't move. Just stared at the screen. Because now, this wasn't internal conflict anymore. It was official. Jessica walked into his office minutes later. She already knew. Her voice was quieter now. Tell me this isn't real. But her eyes said something else. Fear. Not for the company. For what was coming. Jonathan called me one last time. They will try to discredit you. A pause. That is standard. Another pause. Do not react emotionally. I wasn't emotional anymore. Not about them. Not about Jessica. Not about my father. I was something else now. Prepared. At 3:00 p.m. Doors opened on the 42nd floor of Whitford Tower. Executives entered one by one. My father arrived last. And when he saw me sitting at the table, he finally understood something he had avoided for years. I wasn't here to ask for permission anymore. I was here because the system he built had already started answering to me. The boardroom on the 42nd floor of New York City didn't feel like a room anymore. It felt like a pressure chamber. Glass walls. Cold light. Too many seats for too few truths. One by one, they entered. Executives. Directors. Lawyers. No one spoke freely. Because in that room, words had consequences now. My father walked in last. Same posture. Same control. Same belief that the room still belonged to him. But something was different. He didn't look at me first. He looked at the table. Jessica was already inside. She didn't sit next to him. She didn't sit next to me either. She sat in the middle. Between two collapsing worlds. The chairman spoke. This emergency meeting has been called to verify claims regarding ownership and governance structure. A pause. And to determine control authority. Jonathan Hale placed the folder on the table. No drama. No emotion. Just procedure. This is unnecessary. My father's voice cut through. Controlled. Sharp. This is a misunderstanding built on incomplete interpretation. But no one responded immediately. That silence was new. Jonathan stood. Calm. Certain. The documentation has been independently verified. A pause. The voting structure of Whitford Properties is not what was previously assumed. I saw it immediately. Not panic. Not shock. But recalculation. Everyone in the room was rethinking alignment. She is not qualified. He started. But the chairman interrupted. We are not discussing qualifications. A pause. We are discussing ownership. Jessica finally spoke. Her voice wasn't strong. It was tired. Dad, is it true? That was the first crack. Not legal. Emotional. This is family interference. He stood now. She is being manipulated by external counsel. But his voice wasn't stable anymore. It was defensive. I stood. For the first time in my life. I didn't feel small in that room. I placed the letter on the table. And read it aloud. Dulce is not slow. She was abandoned. She sees what others refuse to see. She is the only one I trust to protect what I built. No one spoke. Not because they were confused. Because they understood. Jonathan spoke again. The controlling voting rights are valid and active. A pause. They transfer upon activation conditions already met. My father sat down slowly. Not defeated. Not angry. Just realizing that everything he built was never fully his. Jessica stood up. She looked at him. Then at me. You never saw her. Her voice broke slightly. You only saw what was convenient. Silence. That line landed harder than any legal document. The chairman spoke. We will now acknowledge governance control as stated in the verified structure. A pause. Miss Whitford. He looked at me directly. You hold majority authority. It didn't feel like victory. No music. No celebration. No applause. Just silence. And alignment shifting in real time. He looked at me. Not as a failure. Not as a problem. But as something he had misunderstood for 28 years. You were never slow. He said quietly. Were you? I didn't smile. I didn't retaliate. I just answered honestly. No. The chairman asked. What are your intentions for the company? I paused. Because everyone expected revenge. But that wasn't the point. Stability. A pause. And restructuring based on competence, not inheritance. My father said nothing. Jessica looked down. Not defeated. But changed. That night in New York City, the city felt different. Not because I had power, but because I no longer needed permission to exist inside it. They called me the slow one for 20 years. But in the end, I wasn't slow. I was just the only one who saw the system clearly enough to change it.
Thanking you for watching Revenge Echo channel. Like, subscribe and comment where you are watching from.